In this demonstration, we're going to assign Azure policy guest configurations. So we're going to go ahead and log into the Azure portal. So theoretically, if we're really using Azure to its utmost capability, we have machines on premises, we might have virtual machines up in Azure, we have a lot of different components that we might be managing. And maybe we have a situation where we want to make sure that these things are configured in a way that's adhering to best practice, or at least that is set up properly for our environment. So what this allows us to do is to create policies that will enforce settings on all of these different resources. And it can enforce the settings. Depending on the setting, it could just say, hey, this is out of compliance, and then you need to go fix it yourself. And then other settings, it actually could remediate it and change the setting automatically so that it's in compliance. There's a couple of different ways to work with this. If you're looking at Azure overall as a whole, we want to go into policy. So I'm going to go into all services, and I can just type in policy. And this is the section that we want to be in. Now, there is a policy that comes with Azure by default. You can see that I'm not compliant. And it's because it wants us to set up certain things for the Azure tenant, enable threat detection capabilities, and so on and so forth. And so this was already assigned as a policy to kind of encourage people that get into Azure to set things up in a way that's going to make the most use out of Azure. But when you're setting up your own Azure policy guest configuration, what you're essentially doing is defining your own policies. And so we're here on overview, which is just kind of giving us a snapshot of compliance. This is just a little trial account, so I don't see much in here. In getting started, it said, well, okay, you can use this to do real-time control and assess compliance at scale. But if we want to set up a policy, we need to go into compliance. And so what we want to do is go ahead and assign policy. And it comes in and says, well, let's get the basics out of the way. What is the scope where this policy takes effect? So here, by default, it wants to affect everything in my subscription. If I wanted to, I could limit it to a particular resource group, maybe Azure Arc. If not, I can leave the scope set to the subscription. And then if I have a pretty broad scope, but I want to limit it, so I want to exclude something there, that's why we have exclusions. So I can say, well, this applies to everything except a particular resource group, if I wanted to do that. But the big thing is to select a policy definition. Now I can click the ellipse here and see there are tons of policy definitions, 967, that come with Azure. You can also go through and create your own policy definitions. So let's say for on-premises servers, there's a setting in the registry that has to be set. I could actually create a policy that relates to that and would automatically set that setting in the registry if it wasn't already set. Just for the purpose of the demonstration, we're going to pick one that already comes with Azure. I'm just going to search for server. And there's still 61 with just server in it. And let's pick one. So we'll say, okay, Azure Defender for servers should be enabled. If I want to, I can put in a description if I want to add any additional notes for my colleagues. And then down here, I can say whether or not I want it to be enforced. So just kind of staging this, I don't want to turn it on right now. I could set that to disabled. We're going to leave it to enabled. That's fine. Now we get to parameters, but there are no parameters that I need to provide. Sometimes there are parameters that you need to give answers for, but we don't. And then we see remediation. So you notice by default, this is only going to take effect on newly created resources. If I have existing resources, I would need to create a remediation task that's going to go through and apply this policy after the fact. And then if deploy if not exist policies, meaning it's going to make a change if whatever it is out of compliance, then I'm going to need to create a task that's going to do that. If there is going to be a change made, by this policy on the server. So I've said, well, Defender has to be on. Maybe there needs to be an account that has the rights to make that change. And that's what they're talking about down here with managed identity. So maybe this particular policy requires a managed identity in order to complete that remediation. If that's the case, I can choose to create a managed identity, and then I have a choice between a system-assigned managed identity or a user-assigned where I can go ahead and use an existing user account effectively. I'm just going to do a system-assigned managed identity. That's fine. And then I can also set a custom message that will be displayed to users if there is a situation where something's out of compliance. Something that would help them to understand what exactly is the problem. And then finally, I can go through. If everything looks good, I'm going to go ahead and create the policy. And it may take a few minutes for the policy to appear. Sometimes things in Azure can take a bit of a long time. Now, this is one way to go ahead and deploy these types of policies. Another way to do this is if you're using Arc, you can do this inside the machines themselves. So while we're waiting for our policy to appear, let's just go ahead and check out the other spot where we can do this. So I'm going to go into Arc. And we're going to go down to servers. So if you do have some servers that you're managing with Arc, you can go in, take a look at this. And sometimes when you're creating a policy out in the sort of universal policy definitions area, it will prompt you, hey, do you want to include Arc servers? Otherwise, if you want to scope this a little more, within the servers themselves, you have a section that says policies. And you can actually see this policy has sort of flowed on down. And this is inheriting it from the universal policies. But if I wanted a policy that just affected this server, I could go to assign policy here. I'm going to see the same wizard, but it's just going to be applied in here. And you can see already, even though we didn't see it out in the policies tab, we didn't see our new policy showing up, we can see that it has actually been applied to this server, and you can see that it's not started. This can take a while, particularly if it's a trial account, even in a regular tenant, sometimes an hour, a couple hours. So if you're playing around with this, really give this time for it to kick in. So that's how we can assign Azure Policy Guest configurations inside of Azure, which allow us to create specifications that would help us determine if our resources are in compliance and maybe even automatically remediate them if they're not.